Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming out on Tuesday night with Dr. Ashwin Patel talking in session number 2 of his two-part series for our coaches here in HEO, talking about the importance of preparation. We did send out 2 sheets for you guys to follow along with tonight, 2 worksheets if you want to use those. They would be attached to the email that I did send out this afternoon or this morning. I can't remember. But Ash, all yours.
Thanks, Jeff. Hey, everybody. Great to see you all again. It looks like some familiar names from the last session. And I wanted us to kind of talk a little bit about, it begins before it begins. And one of the things I've really enjoyed is having a bunch of conversations with coaches. And, in the Guelph area where I live, I do some of these similar talks within the Guelph Minor Hockey Association. But even more interesting is when I have these conversations with some of the Hockey Canada folk, or even some of the professional coaches that I've been able to work with. I often ask, why the heck do you do what you do, right? How often are you going to be involved in coaching where there's a lot of stress? Oftentimes it's a thankless profession. It takes you away from your family and from your loved ones. And so some of the things I work with coaches on and future coaches is just this notion of it begins before it begins. As a coach, how are we kind of grounding ourselves with our decisions, how we want to communicate with our players, how we want to focus our attention in terms of development, in terms of both personal and playing development. And so that's going to be the focus of today, is really looking at that it begins before it begins. And I love this quote, mostly just because I'm a big dork and I was a history major, history and a psych major in undergrad. But Ben Franklin talked about, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. And for want of a horse, the rider was lost, being overtaken and slain by the enemy, all for want of a little care about a horse shoe nail. And it talks about how, yes, the puck is going to drop and then the players are going to play, but what's the time and the energy that is put into that preparation? And another example, I love, I'll go to the quote before, after I talk about John Wooden. John Wooden was a legendary coach in college basketball. He won 10 national championships within 12 years at UCLA. While it's important to also recognize that he didn't win a national championship his first 16 years as a coach. But he started every single practice of, the first practice of every season, showing the players how to put on socks correctly, take off socks correctly, put them back on, and then learn how to tie their shoes. And I remember hearing this story at my old university. The president of the university played for Coach Wooden at UCLA in the 1971 to 1973. And I asked him, is this a made up story or is this true? And he says, no, it's absolutely true. We spent 45 minutes of the very first practice tying our shoes and putting on our socks. And when he was asked about this, when John Wooden was asked about this, he talked about, again, they were playing with those Chuck All-Stars that I'm sure we're all familiar with. But he says, those shoes, you got blisters really easily. And back in that day that you get blisters, and I remember playing high school basketball in the late 80s, early 90s, and I remember getting blisters. And that's pretty much the rest of the season that you're dealing with those blisters. And so it's hard to be able to progress as a team if you're not doing those little things right. So how do you focus on those little things as we are getting ready to coach the athletes that we're working with? And so there's another quote I wanted to share with you, and this is Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll is the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. He used to coach in USC football, and prior to that with the New York Jets in the NFL. And this was his he was having a conversation with Steve Kerr, again, a several time NBA champion player, as well as a coach who played, with Michael Jordan, who also played with Tim Duncan. So he's been around some excellent players. But Pete Carroll asked Steve Kerr, what I wanted to get you to start to think about was, who are you as a coach? What are you going to stand by? What do you stand for? Because all of those things are going to come into play. Because you're going to be in training camp and some guy's not going to show up for a meeting. Then he's going to be late for the bus. And then he's going to spout off at one of your players during the game. There are all these things that are going to happen. So how are you going to react to them? And this has nothing to do with the X's and O's. So every time you deal with a situation, you're making a statement about who you are. And then the players are going to watch you. Do you believe in something, or are you just dealing with things randomly? In my opinion, that's really the cool stuff about figuring out how to coach. Now, this isn't me at all telling any of you how to coach. You're all experts at what you do. And so, but I do find that some of the interactions I have with coaches, they're like, I just kind of react. Because this was one of the things I had to do in graduate schools. We had to sit down and come up with our teaching philosophy, our counseling philosophy, what that was going to look like, how you deal with situations. And then we spent 6 weeks working on our values. And my values as a 25-year-old when I started graduate school to now, where I'm 46 and well out of graduate school, it has changed. But a lot of the central things that I thought about in terms of my values on how I'm going to communicate with individuals, I think has remained. And my two main things, and I used to coach, not at the level that any of you are at, but I used to coach tennis, I used to coach basketball, and was that I wanted my players to know at all times that I care about them. And I want to know at all times that I'm curious about their learning and what's best for them. And that has kind of framed me as an educator. It has framed my work with Hockey Canada, the Guelph Storm, et cetera, et cetera. So my hope is that today's objectives is that before we can lead, we spend some time thinking about why we do what we do. And so maybe by the end of today, with those worksheets, we could potentially identify our top 3 values. And I know maybe some of you have already done this, but it's never a bad thing to kind of revisit some of those things as to what it is that we value, and understand that there isn't one right set of values. When I've done this with some of the athletes I work with, they're like, Ash, I value money. I'm like, okay. Like, there's no judgment. I respect the heck if that is what you value. That what they said was financial security. Fantastic. So then it was just a matter of, okay, so we know that's what you value. Are you making your decisions that are going to help you achieve that? And that kind of, for me, is the compass that helps point us in the right direction when we're experiencing uncertainty, or when we're challenged as leaders, as a lot of you are and have been, particularly over the last couple of years. So there isn't one correct set of values, and that we have the right to hold any of the values that we so choose. So it is also important to recognize that even amongst the coaching staff, you may not hold the same values, but you can still work effectively together as a group, and that the group might have its own set of values, and that's okay. But I'm sure you've all worked for organizations where they have their values listed on a wall, and then you see that they value integrity, they value honesty, they value open dialogue, and then you're like, I don't see these behaviors being demonstrated at all. So for you as leaders of young men and young women, what are our values? And that's hopefully something that we're going to explore a little bit more. I wanted to share this book. I'm not sure if anybody else read these when you were growing up, but they were called Value Tales, and I have the whole collection. This one in particular, I thought was incredible. So it was like the value of courage, the value of curiosity, the value of honesty, like just insert it. And they had an individual. In this case, it was Jackie Robinson, and I loved baseball, especially when I was a little kid. And I remember reading this book until it like tore apart. My brother actually brought this and talked about this at my wedding at his speech, because he said, I had it, I slept with it, I read it all the time. But what really kind of stood out for me was just like, what the heck is a value? And a value is, your principles or your standards of behaviors. And it kind of is shown as like a judgment of what you find is important in life. And I love the story of Jackie Robinson. I love how he valued courage. And that is what, kind of grounded a lot of the decisions that he made, is that to be courageous in the face of racism, to be courageous when you have thousands of people at a sporting event hating you based on the color of your skin, that to make the decision to walk away from confrontation, the courage to be able to do that when it's a little bit easier to maybe just react and maybe punch an opponent or something along those lines. And then another one I loved was just the story of Terry Fox, which, as as Canadians, we can relate to. I remember watching him run near London, Ontario, when he did that run. I believe it was in 1981, the summer of 1981. But that value of facing a challenge, right? So these values, they form the foundation of who you are. And so we make choices that reflect. So the choices that we make that will reflect the values that we hold. And so do we live a life in a way that aligns with those values? And if it does, it creates a foundation for faith in you as a coach, trust in you that you're going to have their best interest, in the sense of that you are living out your values. And for myself, mine come from my mom and dad, like probably a lot of you. And sadly for me, my mom, this is a picture of them when they first were dating. I think this was in 1971 or 1972. But my mom, she unfortunately died of ovarian cancer when she was 50. And then my father died 7 years almost to the day later of a heart attack. And, again, I lost my mom when I was 24, my dad when I was 31. I'm not sharing this for any other way, but to say that like when my mother was sick, it was always like, her value was always family. It was mandatory one night a weekend that we were together. And, this was before cell phones. So we were just the six of us in our family, spent time together. We would hang out together. We would eat a meal together. We'd prepare a meal together. It didn't matter if we had significant others, unless it was a sporting event. We were home together as a unit, one of the Friday or the Saturday night. And so they valued being part of a family. That was central to who my mom and dad were, and what it has become for my siblings and I with all our respective families. Like, family is of the most importance. So I don't make decisions in my own career unless my wife and my daughters are on board. And I've been very fortunate to be offered an NHL job to work. And we said no, because my wife and my daughters didn't want me to work for this team, because it was going to be far away from the family. And because they are everything to me, and I make my decisions based on, is this going to be good for the family, yes or no? The answer was no in this case. It wasn't hard for me to walk away. And so thinking about that for yourself, why do you think it's important as leaders that we develop and understand our values that we hold? And I like to think of it again as this compass. When we're uncertain, when we may have some hard decisions to make, if we know what our values are, it's a little bit easier to make decisions that align with that. You know what, my value is honest communication. Okay, I'm always going to be upfront and honest. And then and if you say that with your players, I'm always going to care about your well-being, but I'm always going to be honest with you. And then if you share that with the parents, you share that with the players, and then if you provide that honest evaluation, it may be hard, but you know that you're living by your respective values. Now, excuse me, most likely going to sneeze. Excuse me, sorry about that. No, these are some relatively recent screenshots. I could have probably just taken some screenshots over the last month or so, but these are real examples, and why it's so important for us as leaders and you as the leaders of your respective teams to think about your values, to live your respective values, etc. There's too many times I've been, especially when I was living in the States, there'd be some teams I'd work with that would talk about like, this is our values. Like we're family based. We care about each other. We're honest with each other. And then I see that coach that night being unfaithful, to his wife. And I'm like, well, so when I'm with a couple of players that, that were also there, they're like, well, how the heck can I believe in whatever this coach is saying because of that behavior? And the example here is that a former Detroit Lions assistant coach got intoxicated and went through the drive-through of a Wendy's naked. Now, when I've shared this with other coaches in the past, they laugh. But then I said, well, what's practice going to be like the next day? If he's like, all right, guys, we're going to run drills. And they're like, no, we're not. We said, you got arrested for being naked going through a Wendy's. I'm not listening to what you have to say. There's a credibility factor that could go out the window. All that work you put in, again, and sometimes these are just mistakes. Again, in that case, I don't know what's happening. Now, I could have easily clipped the other picture of what Urban Meyer did when he was coaching Jacksonville, that he didn't go home with the team after a game after they played in Cincinnati. And then he goes to his own bar that he owns. And then you see him engaging in whatever. It looked like it was consensual, mutual hanging out with a young woman while his wife was at home with their grandchildren and the rest of their family. So these are, like, again, just some examples of oftentimes it's do what I say, not what I do. Rick Pitino, so a friend of mine, is their mental performance coach for the entire University of Louisville sports system or athletic department. She talked about that, like he was fired pretty much when she got there, but she was like, how am I going to have this conversation? And then she spoke to a lot of the players that are like, he just keeps talking about family and making the right decisions and being a good, honest person. Then he keeps doing these things. He did it at, accusations of him acting inappropriately with the Boston Celtics when he was at the University of Kentucky and then at the University of Louisville. So it's hard sometimes. And again, the last example I'm just sharing is because I talked last time about Pat Summitt, who was arguably the greatest coach in the history of women's basketball. She had a son that became a head coach, was married at a very young age, and then ended up having an inappropriate relationship with one of his players. And I think then ended up, the young woman that he got involved with ended up becoming pregnant. Now, I'm sharing these things not as just kind of as examples of how things can potentially go awry, how in those cases, people were very adamant about like, well, this is what I am. I'm a moral man. I do the right decisions. My best intentions are for my players, but then the behaviors don't line up. And this example has nothing to do with tennis, but this is Billie Jean King with Chris Evert back in the 1970s. And Billie Jean King was the best player, the best tennis player at the time in the world, and protested that they weren't receiving equal pay as the men and playing in the exact same tournaments. And the response was, well, initially women's ratings aren't as high and they're not as talented, and et cetera, et cetera. And those were the comments from the people that were running it. And so she said, fine. And they left. They formed their own association. The Women's Tennis Association started soon afterwards. And they eventually just came back. And because they were able to, all the best women's players were playing in this tournament, in this association, the ATP had to come back and really try to grab them back and guarantee equal pay. And tennis is one of the only sports in the world where there's equal pay amongst men and women on the major tournaments. And a lot of that work was Billie Jean King. So she was willing to give up her career because of her values of equality, that she was willing to walk away until that there were changes at the highest level in terms of how they treat both men and women on the tour. So again, always going back to John Wooden, because he's, I think he was so forward thinking as it comes to this, but values, it's to be consistent in this way requires that leaders know themselves, know what they care about, know what they believe in. So it starts with clarifying your values. So I think, again, before, it begins before it begins. Part of that is, and even if you've been coaching for a while and you've maybe not done this exercise, who are you as an individual? What makes you tick? Why do you coach? How do you deal with adversity? How do you deal with surprises that happen? How do you deal with uncertainties? How do you deal with success, right? So to be consistent in terms of our values means that we do need to know ourselves. We really, again, have to know what it is that we care about. And John Wooden was very much adamant about, making the right decisions. So he was a very religious individual. So he respected other people's religions, but he would sprinkle in his faith in how he would have these conversations with a lot of his players. But he also had some non-negotiables, right? Like what he believed in. He believed in conformity in terms of how they looked. He was very big on presentation, not unlike the New York Yankees when George Steinbrenner took over, where they wouldn't allow facial hair with the New York Yankees for years. And John Wooden had a very similar policy. He respected and allowed everybody, different beliefs, religious beliefs, political beliefs, everything along those lines. But he said, when you are representing UCLA, you're going to have no facial hair. And the funny story is that one year, Bill Walton at the time was the reigning college basketball player of the year. They had just won a national championship. He would have been the first pick overall had he left to go in the NBA. He came back, and Bill Walton was very much a free spirit, child of the 60s. I think it was maybe experimenting in some alternative mind expanding drugs. He showed up on campus to begin the next season with a full beard. And he talked about I was confident. This is who I believe that I am, that I should be able to allow myself. I've earned the right to have facial hair. I'm a good person. And he shows up, and John Wooden just looks at him and says, "It's nice to see you, Bill. And our policy with regards to facial hair." And Bill Walton's like, "Yes, sir, yes, coach, I do, but I'm exercising my right to have long facial hair." He's like, "Okay." And John Wooden put out his hand and said, "Listen, I want to thank you for all that you've given the UCLA program. But if you're not going to shave, then you're no longer part of this team." And then he turned around and then he walked back towards the practice that was about to begin, and he was getting ready to do that drill. And so then Bill Walton just stood there, unsure as to what he needed to do. His gamble did not pay off, and he went back in and he dry shaved. And the men on this call, if you're having a beard that was 3 times thicker than the one I have right now, and then he went in and borrowed someone's razor and then dry shaved, and then came out half bloody, and then went to go practice. Now, the example is, again, while you can't really mandate that really anymore, legally you can't ask of that in a job interview. But what he spoke about, and every athlete that pretty much played for John Wooden loved him, admired him until his death, had relationships until he passed away, I believe, at 99 years old. But he had his beliefs. He wasn't a big yeller. He never talked about the word win. He felt that success in the scoreboard would be reflected on the behaviors that they engage in practice and by playing unselfish basketball. So he didn't raise his voice. He never used the word win, but still ended up winning 10 national championships out of 12 years. And players that played for him, they felt like he was there for them. He communicated openly with them. He kept in touch with them after their playing days were over. So it wasn't just, what can you do for me as an athlete? He cared about them as human beings. And I think that's really important. So this is part of that aspect for us, is kind of, how do we clarify our values? So if you have, if you're interested in kind of like doing this right now, you can do this a little bit later. I can just potentially explain it to you right now. If you take a look at the handout that I provided you, there are so many different values that are listed on there. And if you can, maybe even after we're done today, just take some time to think about your top values. It doesn't have to be 10, it could be 5, right? And then after you kind of come up with your respective values, then you take 2 minutes to choose to narrow it down to your top 3. So maybe you take an index card and you put down those top 3. And then finally, maybe another couple of minutes to define each of your values you have on the index card in a sentence. So if it is about you value open dialogue, right? So communication, okay, that's one of my values, is open communication. What would that mean? Well, I value open communication with individuals and encourage them to come speak with me, right? Having an open door philosophy, open door policy along those lines. And so that is one of the things that is truly value driven for you as a coach. Then players then know that they can come to you to talk about what's going on, and that you are open to communicate with your respective players. If it is about, again, like no cussing, or if it's about like whatever, just take some time, again, maybe after tonight's call is done, just to really think about what are some of your top 10 values, and then you narrow it down a little bit further, and then you prioritize potentially your top 3, and then you define each of your values, like what it would look like as you're moving forward. And then as we're kind of getting ready to wrap this up, you think about what are some of the beliefs that you hold that support that value. That maybe open communication is going to allow for any misinterpretations to go away. That open communication, while uncomfortable at times, helps us be able to move forward as a team. The belief that open communication goes both ways, and that you will also welcome players being able to say what's on their mind in a constructive or a polite manner. That your belief that you're not going to yell to the coaches, or to the referees or players if and when they make a mistake. So again, it's, you've got that, value of open communication, and then the beliefs are things that are going to feed into that respective value. And then what are some behaviors that you exhibit that support that? So the behaviors is that when I'm frustrated, I take a deep breath. When I'm frustrated, or when I'm going to communicate, but maybe I'm recognizing that I'm elevated, that I might, maybe you've got an assistant coach that's a little bit more level-headed, or that can stay calm in some of those situations. Maybe that's going to be it. We'll still have the open communication, but if I'm frustrated, I try to remain somewhat poker-faced, so that I'm not letting the individuals know that this is what I'm actually feeling, or I'm going to wait and let somebody else communicate what's going on. Another aspect is to think about why that value became important to you. Why did open communication, or again, I'm using that one just as a as a central kind of continuous example here. But how did the value of open communication become important to you? Was it because when you were an athlete, a coach, you had coaches that just, you never knew where you stood, and you were really frustrated by, like, I did this that the coach wanted me to do and then supported it, and then the next time I did the exact same thing and then the coach yelled at me for it, and so I just didn't know where I stood. So again, maybe it's something in the past that has created that value to be important to you. Like I mentioned, my example of my parents, and kind of about how family was the central and the overriding importance to the family, is that, like, as busy as both my mom and my father were, they always made time on Friday or Saturday night, if we weren't playing a sport, that it was family time. The other night when we were teenagers, we could go out with our friends, go out with our significant others. But the other time we were at home, we were making dinner together. We, play cards. We would watch a movie together. We'd go for a walk. It was something. And again, like, that became so important to me that that is what I aspire, and what my wife and I have worked on with our daughters down the road. So again, do you think that was part of your upbringing, or was it something that you learned from somebody, or as the result of something else happening? Again, that open dialogue. I remember, having a coach that said all the time, I'm a big believer in open communication, honest communication. And he's like, and I'm okay. I'm a man. I can handle when you say some things to me too, but just say it in a respectful manner. And I remember, at one point he was really harping on, I was one of the captains on our basketball team in high school, and made a comment based on kind of what I saw, what he was kind of treating one of our younger players on the team. And he tore a strip off of me. Who do you think you are telling me what to do? And I'm like, Coach, you said, and I said it pretty calmly. Like, I was devastated inside, because, I thought I was a captain. I thought, I had his trust and earned his respect, and that he would be willing to listen. But I remember him saying, like, I say what's going on and you don't, contradict me. And, that player's been asking for it. His attitude's been brutal. And I'm like, but you told us at the beginning of the season that we can bring anything up to you as long as we do it in a respectful manner. I used my I language. Like, I've noticed, I and some of our teammates have noticed that you're pretty hard on this one player. And I remember him tearing me, like, just ripping me apart. Like, I should kick you off the team. And I remember just being like, I thought I was just doing what you were encouraging us to do. And I remember speaking to my dad afterwards, and I'm like, I thought I did this right. Like, what did I do wrong? And my dad was very much like, sometimes people say one thing, but they don't really expect it to actually happen on the opposite end. And he's like, that's just the reality. But remember this when you're in the situation. And I remember that as a coach, I always said that I'm open to any feedback, anything that you notice, I want to hear it. And there's times that I'm like, I'm maybe not as excited to receive it, but I've caught myself in remembering, like, do the opposite of what your coach did. And while it was hard a couple of times to hear some of the comments, and I had that my students say the same thing, I've learned from it. But I do think that it's really important, and it really has influenced how I lead others in the roles that I'm in, both in academia, but also in associations that I'm involved with. That, like, there's some non-negotiables, right? Like, for me, it's certain times are family times, and that's it. Certain things in terms of honesty, I think, is critically important. That it's important to be honest. It's not to provide falsehoods for everybody else, like, to be as truthful as possible. So again, how do our values then influence how we lead others? So before we wrap it up, and happy to answer any questions that you may have, our principles or our standards of behavior, these are what our values are. So it's a judgment of what we find is important in our life. This is our North Star. This is our compass. If you believe in this kind of, this notion of having those values. But if we know when we live our values, it does make it easier in terms of our decisions, because we can, like, just pretty much look at, like, this is taking me away from being north. This is going south. This is going west. This is going east. And I want to make decisions that are going to help myself, the people that I love, the people that I lead, go in that direction. So again, it can also help our athletes learn and live their values. And so I realized this might have been a little bit of a departure for what we thought this was going to be in terms of it begins before it begins. But I guess in my opinion, this is the foundation. This is the cement that is poured down. And once we kind of understand that base of what our values are, everything else can kind of build on top of it. So I want to thank you for your time and open up to any questions. And if you have no questions that you run out of time tonight, you'd like to ask, there's my email address right there. Happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Ash. That was really good. I do have one question for our coaches on the call tonight. How important do you think it is to share those values that you believe in with your players and your parents? I'm not sure if you heard me. Ash, can you hear me?
I think it's.
Sorry to me. No, I heard you.
Yeah.
Are you sorry, Jeff? Was that directed to me?
Yeah. So, how important do you think it is to share with your values with your players and your parents?
I mean, I believe it to be important. I think what happens a lot of times, at least from my experiences that I've seen, like every team that I've ever worked with, I'll go in and one of the first things I look at is like, what does that mean? How often do we live that? And I remember like some people are like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, it says like some of these values, right? Like, we will be, honest with each other as we're moving towards, team success. Oh, okay. We're going to give 100% with everything that we do. I mean, some of these are just like made up terms, but I'll ask, like, how are these lived? Are these just words on a wall? Because again, that's what really frustrates me. And sometimes I even ask the players, I'm like, how many of you actually look at some of these words on the wall? And half the time they're like, it's just white noise. I don't really look at any of those things. It's kind of like seeing flyers up in a hallway when you're in school, and we sometimes just walk right by it, not really paying attention. But I've always encouraged, like, let's really figure out what the values of our organization are. And when I was first chatting with a CHL team about this exact topic, I said, what are your values? And they sent me a list of them. I'm like, who came up with these? Was this a collaborative thing? Was this one person just kind of saying, this is what we value? And they shared, no, like this was the ownership group, general managers, coaches, and inputs from the players. I'm like, fantastic. So then how do we live those things each day? So the messaging then has to be consistent. If this is truly what it is that you value. And because one of the questions was, is it okay if we say that we want to be the best? And I'm like, yeah, but we have to define what best means. Does best mean that we win a Memorial Cup or bust? Is it about having either, the OHL championship, Q championship, the W championship? Like, what is it that best? The best people, the best number of players that make it or get drafted into the NHL. So I do think it's important to be clear, but then, share that. And I think that's something that, in Guelph, that we've spent some time working on that. That's something that like the players know, that there are certain words that we discuss and certain values that we hold that are non-negotiables and that help make our decisions that much easier. And so I always think it's important to be transparent. Now, again, the challenge for a lot of us is that, some parents might be like, yeah, that makes sense. But then the next day they go back to, why is my son not playing on first PP? And that's then the reality that you have to deal with. And you're like, but we're talking about that, let's just say promptness and respect to the time that we have together is important. And this player is always late, right? So then what it's suggesting then to the rest of the team is like, well, no, like the rules, then the values don't really apply to you. Just like with John Wooden, again, the best player in college basketball, he was willing to walk away because that player wasn't ascribing to the values that was made clear on a daily basis to anybody that was part of UCLA basketball. And then again, Bill Walton afterwards said that's one of the best lessons he's ever learned in his life. He says that helped him keep him grounded so that he didn't get to the NBA with a big head, that he recognized that there were some things that were really important. And he says those are some of the values that he's then passed along to his sons, one of whom played in the NBA and who was a coach for a while. Like, yeah, it's a great lesson because it's more than just about playing hockey.
Awesome. We do have one more question here. How would you consider super successful coaches that might make a minor gaffe? Does that reduce their overall quality, or can we address a zero fault society? For example, like a Mike Babcock.
If I'm hearing the question correctly, is that like, if someone makes a mistake? Yeah,
Essentially, yes.
Yeah, we all make mistakes. I think the challenge is that sometimes we excuse it away. I've found that when, I've really respected some of the coaches that I've worked with that have just come in after a game and said, you know what, guys, I messed up. I've talked about the importance of us maintaining our composure, and I lost my composure today. And that's on me. And I hope that you learn that, like, was it effective? How many of you felt uncomfortable? Like, and this coach was awesome at owning it. And I kind of talked to some of the players afterwards, like, what coach said, what did that mean to you? That, like, so many times coaches make mistakes, or they'll tell us to do one thing and they'll do the exact opposite. And he called himself out for it. So they actually respected the fact that he was honest, that it was so important to maintain your composure. He didn't do it. It caused a bench minor, which then led us to have a penalty kill, which we did not kill off. We ended up losing by 1. And the coach came into the dressing room afterward, and he came in and he said, before we do anything else, I have to own my mistake. I talk all the time about composure. We practice composure in practice, and I failed to live by that. And the guys afterwards, it's okay, coach, we all make mistakes. It was a really good learning opportunity, but it also let the players know that coaches make mistakes too. But the fact that he owned it, addressed it, and people moved on from it, it didn't stay. The challenge is that sometimes when you're a little bit defiant, like Urban Meyer kind of was with Florida, and I had friends that worked with Urban Meyer at different stops in his coaching career. One at Bowling Green when he first got started, another one at Utah, and another one at Ohio State. All of them mentioned that his behaviors got worse, that his moral fiber and the values that he espoused changed, right? That he would say certain things and his behaviors were on the opposite side. He was very prominent in kind of coining the above the line or below the line behaviors. He put a line on the middle of the page and say, what's acceptable behavior, what's unacceptable behavior. And he would try to hold his players accountable to it. And then hired a strength and conditioning coach at Ohio State that was abusive to his wife, brought that same coach initially to Jacksonville, and only when the backlash came did he let him go. So he's talking about the importance of family and about character in terms of who he's hiring, and then those things happen. And then he was like, he just kind of like brushed it off. And that's what got frustrating. At least, for a colleague of mine that works for the Jaguars said that he's like, he lost the room immediately when he did that, because then those words don't have any meaning behind it, because his actions weren't backing that up. And I think, giving credit, as players get a little bit older, just kind of giving credit to the fact that, like, everything we say and do has meaning and can have impact. And it's hard, but I think that's one of the amazing reasons why a lot of you are coaches, because of all of those amazing positive impacts that you can have within the people that the young men and women that you're going to be working with as they're progressing as a coach.
Awesome.